Hi friends, welcome back. Today we are going to continue reading James Herriot's Treasury for Children stories. The second story we are reading is Only One Woof, illustrated by Peter Barrett. One nice thing about being a country vet is that there are so many interesting things to see when I visit the farms. One sunny spring day, I visited Mr. Wilkins' farm, and I laughed as I watched the two sheepdog puppies playing together in the farmyard. "Those two really love each other, don't they?" I said. Mr. Wilkin nodded. "Yeah, they are great friends. They are never apart." Mr. Wilkin was a busy man, with many cows, pigs, and sheep to look after, but he still had time for his favorite hobby, breeding and training sheepdogs. For many years he had won silver cups all over the country. From the latest litter, he had picked up the two best pups, Gip and Sweep, and he was going to train them to run in the sheepdog trials. The two little animals were rolling about in a happy wrestling match, growling and panting, chewing gently at each other's legs. Then suddenly they stopped playing as something else caught their attention. "Look at that!" I cried in amazement. "They're behaving like grown-up dogs." The pups were beginning to round up a group of tiny ducklings, much to the annoyance of the mother duck. With noses outstretched and stomachs nearly flat on the cobbles of the farmyard, they crept up on the ducklings. "Yes," the farmer replied. "They are only 12 weeks old, but their mother and father, their grandmothers and grandfathers, and way back as long as I can remember, were all sheepdogs. So these little things were born wanting to round up chickens, ducks, lambs, anything they see." The two doggy friends were different in appearance. Sweep was black and white, while Gip was black, white, and brown. But the thing you noticed most was that the one of Gip's ears stuck up while the other ear lay flat against his head. This gave him a funny, lopsided look. In fact, he looked a bit of a clown, but he was a friendly, tail-wagging clown. "There's one thing odd about Gip," Mr. Wilkins said. "He's never barked at all." I looked at him in surprise. "You mean never ever?" "That's right, not a single bark. The other dogs make a noise when strangers come to the farm, but I've never heard Gip make a sound since he was born." I shook my head. How very strange. I've never heard of such a thing. I got into my car, and as I drove away, I noticed that while Sweep and two other dog farms barked their farewells loudly, Gip merely wagged his tail and looked at me in a friendly manner, his pink tongue rolling out of his open mouth, a silent dog. Some months later, just before Christmas, George Crossley, one of Mr. Wilkins' oldest friends, and a very keen sheepdog trainer came to ask if he could buy a dog, as his own old dog had died. Mr. Wilkins sold Sweep to him. I was a bit surprised about this because I knew that Sweep was further forward in his training than Gip, and looked like turning into a real champion. But it was Gip he kept. Perhaps it was because he just liked him. He was a funny dog with that lopsided charm that was difficult to resist. Gip must have been sad to lose his brother and best friend, and there was no doubt that he missed him. But there were other dogs on the farm, and even if they didn't make up for Sweep, he was never really lonely. Although Gip grew up big and strong, he wasn't quite clever enough to compete in the trials. So he just helped Mr. Wilkin by herding the sheep and cattle on the farm. He was very happy to be out with his master all day, but perhaps he wondered where his doggy friend had gone. It wasn't until the following June that I next visited the farm to see a sick cow, and I saw Gip, now fully grown, rocking along on a hay cart. I spotted him again at harvest time, chasing rats among the stooks. He was always glad to see me, full of fun, bright-eyed, and affectionate, but soundless. There was a very long spell when none of Mr. Wilkins' animals needed my help, and I did not see him or Gip until I met them both at a sheepdog trial the following summer. The huge field where the trial was being held was on the river's edge, and the sunshine glittered on the water. The cars were drawn up along the side of the field, and groups of men, mainly competitors, stood around chatting as they watched the dogs working with the sheep. They were dressed in all sorts of clothing: cloth caps, trilbies, deerstalkers, or sometimes no hat at all, tweed jackets, best suits, open-neck shirts, fancy ties, and sometimes neither collar nor tie. Nearly all of them leaned on the long crooks with the handles carved from ram's horns. Their dogs, waiting their turn, were tied to the fence, and it was wonderful to see the long row of waving tails and friendly expressions. Few of the dogs knew each other, but there was not a single growl, never mind a fight. I went over to Mr. Wilkin, who was leaning against his car, which was parked within sight of the final pen. Gip was tied to the bumper and was watching with interest as each dog took its turn. Miss Wilkin was sitting on a camp stool by his side. "Are you running a dog today, Mr. Wilkin?" I asked. "No, not this time. I have just come to watch," he replied. I had been there for about 10 minutes when suddenly the farmer lifted a pointing finger. "Look who's there!" George Crosley with Sweep were making their way to the starting post. Gip suddenly stiffed up and sat very straight, one ear crooked, the other flat, making him look more lopsided than ever. It was over a year since he had seen his brother, and it seemed unlikely, I thought, that he would remember him. But he was obviously very interested, and as the judge waved his white handkerchief to begin the trial and the 3 sheep that were released from the far corner of the field, Gip rose slowly to his feet. A gesture from Mr. Crosley sent Sweep racing around the edge of the field in a white, joyous gallop, and as he neared the sheep, a whistle from Mr. Crosley made him drop to his stomach. From then on, it was easy to see that Sweep was going to be a champion as he darted and crouched at his master's commands. Short whistles, long whistles, Sweep understood them all. No other dog all day had brought his sheep through the 3 pairs of gates as easily as Sweep did. Now, and as he neared the final pen, it was obvious that he was going to win unless the sheep scattered at the last moment. George Crosby opened the gate wide and held out his crook. I could hardly hear his commands to Sweep, but his quiet words brought the dog, wriggling inch by inch over the grass towards the sheep. Were they going to go bounding away and spoil everything? I held my breath. But no, after hesitating and looking around a few minutes, the sheep turned and entered the pen, and Mr. Crosley banged the gate behind them. As he did so, he turned to Sweep with a happy cry of, "Good lad!" and the dog answered with a quick wag of his tail. At that, Gip, who had been standing very still, watching every move intently, raised his head and gave a single loud bark which echoed round the field. "Woof!" went Gip, and we all stared at him in astonishment. "Did you hear that?" gasped Miss Wilkin. "Well, I don't believe it," her husband burst out, looking open-mouthed at his dog. Gip didn't seem to realize that he had done anything unusual. George Crossley came over with Sweep, and the 2 dogs greeted each other happily. Mr. Wilkin let Gip off his lead, and within seconds the 2 dogs were rolling around, chewing playfully at each other, as they used to do as pups. I suppose the Wilkins, as well as myself, had the feeling that this event might encourage Gip to bark like any other dog, but it was not to be. 6 years later, I was at the farm and went to the house to get some hot water. As Miss Wilkin handed me the bucket, she looked down at Gip, who was basking in the sunshine outside the kitchen door. "There you are, you funny fellow," she said to the dog. I laughed. "Has he ever barked since that day?" Miss Wilkins shook her head. "No, he hasn't. Not a sound. I waited a long time, but I don't think he'll ever bark." "Ah, well, it's not important, but I'll never forget that afternoon at the trial," I said. "Nor will I." Miss Wilkin looked at Gip again. She smiled as she remembered. "Poor old lad, 8 years old and only 1 woof." As always, friends, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this great story by James Herriot. Make sure to tune in tomorrow for the next story. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing stories. Thank you and have a blessed day.